Part 1. The Pharaoh Who Tried to Erase Time. Hey everyone, welcome back. Tonight, we're drifting far, far back, past the dust and ruins, past the desert winds that still whisper through broken pillars and half-buried statues, back to a world that glowed gold beneath the sun, where gods were carved from stone and kings were believed to walk beside them. So, settle in. Let your shoulders relax. Let the noise of the modern world fade, like sand slipping through your fingers, because tonight, we're going to visit a man who wanted to outshine eternity, and who very nearly did. This is the story of Akhenaten, the pharaoh who tried to erase time, the man who changed Egypt's gods, its art, its capital, and even its name, and then vanished so completely that, for centuries, people forgot he had ever existed. It's a quiet story, really. A story about ambition, belief, and what happens when a man convinces himself that the sun will never set on his own reflection. When Akhenaten was born, probably around 1350 BC, Egypt was at its height. The land of the Nile was wealthy, stable, and almost smugly eternal. Its gods were ancient, its priests powerful, and its pharaohs divine by default. Akhenaten's father was Amenhotep III, one of Egypt's golden kings, rich, adored, and the living image of stability. His mother, Queen Tiye, was a formidable woman in her own right, clever, politically skilled, and not afraid to remind priests that even gods answered to royalty sometimes. And somewhere in that palace, amid perfumed corridors and courtyards full of lotus blossoms, a strange, thoughtful boy grew up watching it all. The future Akhenaten. We don't know much about his childhood. Egyptian records weren't big on psychology, and scribes rarely noted whether young princes seemed odd, but it's hard not to imagine him as an observer, pale, slender, slightly removed, staring at the world as though it were a puzzle he could rearrange. Because later, that's exactly what he did. When his father died, Akhenaten inherited one of the richest empires on earth. Temples gleamed with gold, statues towered over cities, and priests kept the old gods very comfortable indeed. The high priests of Amen, the great sun god of Thebes, were especially powerful, almost rivaling the pharaoh himself. And perhaps that's where the first crack formed, because Akhenaten didn't like sharing power, not even with the gods. At first, his changes were subtle. He began to favor one particular aspect of the sun, Aten, the visible disk itself, radiant and impartial. It wasn't a new god, exactly, just one he elevated above the rest. Soon, hymns and inscriptions shifted. Amen was scratched out, replaced with Aten. Then, temples were shut down, the priests dismissed, the idols removed, and just like that, the entire religious system of Egypt, something that had stood for over 1,000 years, began to melt away like wax under sunlight. Now, to most Egyptians, religion wasn't just faith, it was infrastructure. Every city had its temple, every festival, its ritual. The gods were landlords, employers, and local celebrities all rolled into one. To cancel them was like shutting down the government, the economy, and social media all at once. But Akhenaten didn't see it that way. To him, it wasn't destruction, it was revelation. He wasn't abolishing gods. He was clearing the stage for the only one that mattered. In his eyes, Aten was pure truth, light itself. Not hidden in statues, not trapped in stone sanctuaries, but visible to everyone, every day. You could feel Aiden's warmth on your skin. You could see it move across the sky, and Akhenaten believed that made him the pharaoh, Aiden's chosen interpreter. If the sun was God, then he was the sun's voice, and he spoke with divine authority. Naturally, this went to his head. The art of Egypt began to change almost overnight. Gone were the stiff, godlike postures of earlier kings. Now, carving showed Akhenaten with long limbs, heavy lips, and an oddly stretched face. His belly bulged softly, his chest sloped, his neck curved like a reed. To later generations, it looked strange. People have argued for centuries about it. Was he sick? Androgynous? Artistic? But in truth, it was all symbolic. Akhenaten wanted his artists to portray life as it really was, or as he saw it, fluid, warm, imperfect. The royal family appeared together in intimate scenes, eating, kissing, playing with their daughters under the rays of the Aten. It was oddly tender for Egyptian art, human, almost domestic. The gods' rays reached down like hands, ending in tiny onks, touching the faces of the king, queen, and their children. To Akhenaten, it was beautiful. To everyone else, it was concerning. The capital of Egypt had always been Thebes, grand, ancient, crowded with temples. But Akhenaten didn't want a city built for old gods. So, in a breathtaking act of royal impulse, he ordered a new one, right in the middle of the desert. He called it Akhetaten, the horizon of Aten. It was meant to be a perfect city, sun-drenched, isolated, and devoted entirely to his god. Tens of thousands of workers were marched into the desert to build it. Palaces, houses, gardens, tombs, and, of course, open-air temples where Aten's rays could shine without obstruction. Everything was planned, symmetrical, and blindingly bright. There were no dark sanctuaries, no secret rituals, just sunlight. Everywhere, worship took place under the open sky. It must have looked like a miracle, or a mirage, but there was a catch. The desert doesn't care about miracles. The heat was unbearable. The crops struggled. The city, for all its beauty, was barely sustainable. Still, Akhenaten adored it. He and his queen, Nefertiti, one of history's most famously beautiful women, ruled from its palaces, smiling beneath Aten's rays, convinced they had remade the world. For a while, it almost seemed true. Diplomats came and went. Foreign powers, the Hittites, the Mitanni, Babylon, wrote letters begging for aid, for gold, for soldiers. Most of them went unanswered because Akhenaten wasn't really interested in politics anymore. While his empire frayed at the edges, he spent his days composing hymns to Aten and commissioning art that showed himself and Nefertiti in endless poses of divine adoration. It was less a government than a two-person fan club with architectural ambitions. And then, slowly, the cracks began to widen. The economy faltered. Egypt's military prestige faded. Famine and unrest grew. But in Akhetaten, the king simply drew closer to his god. He seemed almost detached, radiant, fragile, and unreachable. In one surviving hymn, he described Aten as the living sun who rises for all mankind. But in practice, Aten's blessing stopped somewhere around the palace walls. When Nefertiti vanished from the record, whether through death, exile, or quiet exhaustion, Akhenaten continued alone. His portraits became even more stylized, his body more elongated, almost ghostly. He renamed himself the living spirit of Aegon, and then, not long after, he too disappeared. No one knows exactly how he died. There was no great war, no dramatic coup. He simply stopped being mentioned, and within a few years, everything he'd built began to vanish with him. His city was abandoned, his temples were dismantled, his name was chiseled off monuments, his images smashed, his memory erased, as though Egypt itself had decided to wake from a strange dream. In the centuries that followed, Akhenaten became a kind of ghost, a missing page in Egypt's story. Even later pharaohs refused to acknowledge him, skipping his name in their lists of kings. To them, he wasn't a reformer or a visionary. He was a heretic, a mistake to be forgotten. But time, as he learned too late, is not easily erased. When archaeologists uncovered the ruins of Amarna, his sunlit city, in the 19th century, they found something hauntingly human. Sculptures of the royal family laughing together, letters from foreign rulers complaining about late shipments, fragments of hymns praising the sunlight, and in all of it, a strange tenderness, the mark of a man who really believed he could reorder the universe. So tonight, as you drift into sleep, maybe picture that lost city under the desert moon, the white walls still gleaming faintly, the statues half buried, their faces turned toward a silent horizon, a pharaoh who loved the sun so much he tried to become it, and was, inevitably, burned away by his own light, because in the end, Akhenaten didn't defeat time, he joined it, quietly, completely, like sand returning to the wind, the queen who died for cleanliness. Hey everyone, welcome back. Tonight, we are drifting forward in time, away from the golden dust of Egypt and into the powdered air of 18th century France, a softer world, at least on the surface, silk rustling through candlelight, perfume clouding the corridors, and somewhere inside the endless glitter of Versailles, a young queen trying very hard to be happy. Her name, of course, was Marie Antoinette, a woman so famous for being misunderstood that even history seems to sigh when it gets to her chapter. She's remembered for excess, vanity, and that infamous K quote she never actually said. But tonight, we're not here for the revolution. We're here for the stillness before it, the strange, delicate piece of a woman who tried to keep the world clean while it quietly fell apart around her. So, if you haven't already, settle in. Let the lights fade a little. Let your mind wander toward marble halls, powdered wigs, and the faint scent of roses carried on air that's just a bit too sweet. Because tonight's story isn't really about politics. It's about perfume and porcelain and the quiet sound of something breaking long before it shatters. Marie Antoinette was born in 1755 in Vienna, long before France had reason to curse her name. Her mother, Empress Maria Theresa, was the most formidable woman in Europe, practical, disciplined, terrifying, and her daughter was not. By all accounts, little Marie was cheerful, musical, and almost aggressively unbothered. She loved dancing, singing, and making friends, all of which were considered minor crimes in the court of the Habsburgs. But she was also a political pawn. As the 15th child of the Empress, her destiny was never her own, and when she was just 14, it was decided for her. She was to marry the heir to the French throne, a shy, slightly awkward boy named Louis Auguste. The match was meant to seal peace between Austria and France, two empires that had spent centuries trying to kill each other. Nothing says, "We're over it," quite like shipping your teenage daughter across the Alps. And so, one spring morning, Marie Antoinette left Vienna in a carriage piled high with lace and good intentions. At the border, there was a ceremonial exchange. Everything Austrian had to go: her clothes, her attendants, even her little dog. She was handed over to France completely remade, symbolically reborn as Marie Antoinette of France. And from that moment, she belonged to a world that would both worship and destroy her. Versailles in the 1770s was less a palace and more a performance art piece. It was a city of mirrors, gossip, and unspoken rules. Every gesture was a statement, every breakfast a public event. And into this dazzling fishbowl stepped a 15-year-old girl who just wanted to make friends. Her new husband, the Dauphin Louis, was polite and gentle, in the way that makes you wish he'd occasionally say something interesting. He preferred hunting, clocks, and not much else. The marriage, in short, got off to a slow start. 7 years slow, to be exact. For those 7 years, the royal couple failed to produce the one thing everyone expected of them: an heir. The blame, naturally, fell on Marie, because history has always had a habit of blaming women for biology. She smiled through it all, throwing parties, learning the impossible etiquette of Versailles, and doing her best to be adored. She succeeded. At first, her youth, her laughter, her Austrian accent, it all felt fresh. France wanted a fairy tale princess, and for a while, she played the part beautifully. Marie Antoinette's obsession with cleanliness began early. Versailles was grand, yes, but also filthy. The palace was crowded, the hallways stank, and the concept of plumbing was still mostly theoretical. Perfume wasn't a luxury, it was survival. So she built her own little paradise, a private retreat just outside the palace called Petit Trianon. There, she could escape the gossip, the courtiers, and most importantly, the smell. It was a world of fresh linens, porcelain basins, and polished marble baths. The queen could finally wash, soak, and exist in peace. She adored bathing, sometimes twice a day, an almost scandalous devotion to cleanliness in a century when most people considered soap a medical risk. Her baths were rituals of calm, the water scented with orange blossom or rose. Servants placed linen towels on heated racks. A silver tray floated nearby, holding fruit, sweetmeats, and the occasional letter. In a world drowning in ceremony, her bath was the only place she could be still. But outside those fragrant walls, the world was shifting. France was in debt, catastrophic debt. Decades of war and indulgence had drained the treasury, and the people were hungry, literally. And there, in Versailles, was the young queen, wearing diamonds the size of grapes and a smile just polished enough to make everyone hate her. She didn't help her case. Her love of fashion became legendary. Hair piled a foot high, powdered to perfection, sometimes decorated with miniature ships or gardens. Her gowns could feed a village, if villages ate silk. To her, it was art, a kind of armor. Each day she dressed to survive the court's scrutiny, hiding her loneliness beneath layers of satin and lace. But to France, she was simply Madame Deficit, the woman spending a fortune while the kingdom starved. By her 20s, Marie Antoinette finally had what she'd wanted most: children, a daughter, then a son, then another. She was radiant, maternal, almost normal. She built a mock farm at Trianon, complete with milkmaids and sheep, where she could pretend, for an hour or two, that she was just another country woman with good taste in porcelain. Of course, the peasants didn't see it as charming. They saw it as delusion, the queen playing shepherdess while they sold their last loaf of bread. Still, she tried to hold on to her world of order and fragrance, even as revolution whispered through Paris. She polished her mirrors and replaced wilted flowers, because what else can you do when the world begins to rot around you? Except try to keep your little corner clean? When Louis finally became king in 1774, it was already too late. The country was collapsing under debt and discontent. The people wanted reform. The nobles wanted protection. The king wanted a nap. Marie tried to be a good queen. She patronized charities, built hospitals, even simplified her wardrobe. But it was like tossing petals into a storm. Pamphlets began circulating, obscene, cruel, wildly imaginative. They accused her of affairs, of waste, of treason. Some claimed she bathed in milk while her people starved, which was untrue, but believable. And that's usually enough. Every gesture she made, every bath, every ribbon, every pearl, became evidence against her. Her cleanliness was no longer seen as refinement, but vanity. Her privacy as secrecy. Her perfume as poison. When the revolution finally came, it didn't arrive like thunder. It crept in like mold, quiet, inevitable, and impossible to clean away. The mob stormed Versailles in October 1789. They dragged the royal family from their beds, paraded them through the rain, and installed them in Paris under watch. The queen who once bathed in rosewater now washed with whatever she could find in a tin basin. Still, she kept her dignity. Even her enemies admitted that. She remained calm, polite, immaculate, a ghost of the woman she once was, but still composed. As France devoured itself, she sat quietly, sewing, writing letters, caring for her children. She had lost her crown, her palace, her husband's trust, and most of her hair, but she never lost her manners. When Louis was executed in January 1793, she didn't cry, at least, not where anyone could see. She wore black, she prayed, and she waited. By October, her turn had come. They called her Widow Capet now, as if removing her name could make her less human. In her cell, she tried to stay clean, even with no perfume, no silk, no attendants. She washed with cold water from a cracked jug, combed her hair with her fingers, and folded her single dress each night before lying down. The morning of her execution, she apologized to the executioner for stepping on his foot. It was the last thing she ever said. The blade fell, and the crowd roared. But it wasn't triumph they were cheering for. It was the end of something they didn't quite understand. A century of illusion, powdered and perfumed until the very last breath. And maybe that's why Marie Antoinette lingers in our memory. Not because of her wealth or her foolishness, but because she seemed so tragically human. A woman born into a world already crumbling, doing what she could to keep it beautiful for just a little longer when everything else decayed. Politics, morality, even mercy. She clung to cleanliness, to perfume, to poise, because for her, order was peace, and peace, no matter how small, was worth dying for. So, as we drift towards sleep tonight, think of her, not the caricature, not the queen with cakes and diamonds, but the woman sitting alone in a candlelit bath, closing her eyes, letting the scent of roses mask the smell of fear outside her door. Because sometimes, when the world collapses, the only rebellion left is to stay clean. The emperor who ate the moon Hey everyone, welcome back. Tonight, we are drifting into the marble shadows of ancient Rome, a city that glittered by torchlight and smelled faintly of smoke, ambition, and too many public baths. It's a place where every whisper could get you killed, and every emperor was a god, until he wasn't. And tonight's story belongs to one of the strangest of them all, Emperor Nero, a man so theatrical, so entirely himself, that even 2,000 years later, historians still can't decide whether he was mad, misunderstood, or simply bored. He ruled the world's greatest empire, and then set it on fire. He sang while Rome burned, or so the story goes. But tonight, we'll wander past the flames and the scandals and look for something quieter. The sad, soft echo of a man who tried to live as both artist and emperor and ended up swallowed by his own performance. So if you haven't already, get comfortable, loosen your thoughts. Let's drift back to marble columns, moonlight over the Tiber, and a young man with too many titles and not nearly enough sense. Nero Claudius Caesar Augustus Germanicus, which is far too long a name for someone who mostly wanted to be a musician, was born in 37 AD. His mother, Agrippina the Younger, was ambitious enough to make Machiavelli look indecisive. His father died mysteriously, as powerful Roman fathers tended to do, and his mother married Emperor Claudius, a man known for stammering, scholarship, and the kind of luck that usually ends in poisoning. When Claudius conveniently died of mushrooms, allegedly, Nero became emperor at just 16. He was charming, handsome, artistic, and briefly, everything Rome hoped he'd be. The Senate adored him. The people adored him. Even the army, that eternal headache of emperors, tolerated him. For a while, anyway. But Nero had a problem. He didn't actually like being emperor. He liked music, poetry, acting, and Rome, in all its dusty masculinity. Did not take kindly to emperors who preferred liars to legions. Still, he tried. He tried to rule, to perform, to please everyone, which, as history reliably teaches, is the fastest way to lose control of everything. At first, his reign wasn't disastrous. He cut taxes, built theaters, and even banned blood in the gladiatorial games. It was, briefly, a golden age of art and architecture, but behind the scenes, Nero's world was already wobbling. His mother, Agrippina, wanted to rule through him, and when Nero began to grow up, he realized he was sharing power with a woman who knew far too much about poison. So he did what most overburdened sons of ambitious mothers have probably daydreamed about, though very few have attempted. He tried to kill her, several times. First, by collapsing her ceiling while she slept. Then, by sabotaging her boat so it would sink in the Bay of Naples. When she swam ashore, furious, drenched, and entirely alive, Nero gave up on subtlety and sent soldiers. They stabbed her in her villa. It said her last words were, "Strike the wound that bore him." Poetic, terrifying, entirely Roman. After Agrippina's death, Nero's hold on reality softened. He spent more and more time performing, literally performing, on stage. He sang, acted, and played instruments before carefully selected audiences who, for obvious reasons, never clapped too soon. Senators sat for hours, pretending to be enthralled, while the most powerful man on earth recited Greek tragedies about doomed heroes. And maybe that's all Nero ever wanted to be, a doomed hero. Someone tragic and talented, not cruel or careless. But the thing about power is, it magnifies everything, even bad art. Then came the fire. In 64 AD, a massive blaze tore through Rome. It lasted for days, consuming entire districts, turning temples and homes to ash. No one knows how it started, but rumor, that tireless Roman companion, said Nero did it himself. The story goes that he stood on a tower, watching the city burn while playing his lyre and singing of Troy's destruction. It's an image so perfect, it's almost certainly false. But like all good stories, it was true enough in spirit, because when the flames died down, Nero didn't rebuild Rome as it was. He built it as he wished it had been, a city of marble, order, and grand symmetry. At its center, he constructed his masterpiece, the Domus Aurea, the Golden House. It wasn't a palace so much as a dream. Frescoed ceilings, revolving dining rooms, artificial lakes, statues taller than most temples, and a colossal image of himself at the entrance, stretching nearly 100 feet high. For Nero, the fire was never a tragedy. It was a blank canvas. For everyone else, it was proof that he had lost his mind. To distract the people, he found a convenient scapegoat: the Christians, a small, unpopular sect that worshipped an executed prophet. He accused them of starting the fire, and what followed was one of the earliest persecutions in history. They were crucified, burned alive, thrown to beasts in Nero's gardens as entertainment. And so the artist emperor, who loved music and beauty, filled his nights with screams instead, because power has a way of staining even the gentlest intentions. Still, Nero believed he was loved. He toured Greece, performing as a singer, actor, and charioteer. The Greeks, being polite hosts, gave him every award available. He returned to Rome with hundreds of trophies and no sense of irony. But while he was performing abroad, rebellion bloomed at home. Generals, governors, and senators, everyone who had once smiled too hard at his poems, began quietly turning against him. By the time Nero returned, his empire was already gone. The Senate declared him a public enemy. Even his guards deserted him. So he fled Rome in disguise, accompanied only by a few loyal servants and a profound sense of disbelief. They say he muttered, "What an artist dies in me," before plunging a dagger into his throat. The wound was hesitant, the death slow, and for a moment, Rome's last Julio Claudian emperor lingered between life and legend. The actor finally overtaken by his own tragedy. He was 30 years old. Nero's name would become a curse. Future emperors erased his images, melted his statues, scratched his face off coins. And yet, centuries later, his legend survived, more vivid than any of his conquerors, because Rome, for all its cruelty, never forgot spectacle. And Nero had been nothing if not spectacular. Maybe that's the quiet truth of his story. He wasn't evil in the way monsters are evil. He was simply lost. A boy handed the world when he only wanted a stage. He tried to make life beautiful, but he didn't understand that beauty built on suffering burns as easily as oil. The man who sang of Troy's fall ended up becoming its echo, an emperor watching his own empire crumble into flame, mistaking destruction for art. So tonight, as you drift towards sleep, imagine Nero's Rome, the marble gleaming in moonlight, the colonnades stretching into silence, the faint, faraway hum of a lyre echoing through the ruins. Somewhere, maybe, he's still playing, still trying to finish his song, still believing that if he plays softly enough, the world might forgive him, because in the end, even emperors want what we all want, to be remembered kindly, to have our mistakes fade before the music does. The prince who collected time. Hey everyone, welcome back. Tonight, we're drifting quietly into the late Renaissance, that peculiar in-between world where alchemy still whispered in laboratories, and science was just beginning to clear its throat. It's a gentler sort of madness we'll visit tonight, the kind that wears velvet robes and stares at candle flames, asking them questions the stars no longer answer. Our story belongs to Emperor Rudolph II of the Holy Roman Empire, though holy, Roman, and empire were all, by his time, mostly wishful thinking. He ruled from Prague, a city that looked like it had been designed by a poet who had trouble with geometry, and Rudolph, the poet emperor himself, turned it into the strangest, most enchanted court in Europe, filled with magicians, scientists, painters, astrologers, and one very confused giraffe. But underneath the gold and the wonder, Rudolph was lonely, deeply, profoundly, almost artistically lonely. He wanted to understand everything: God, nature, time, love, but found, as many do, that the closer he looked, the more everything blurred. So tonight, let's walk softly through his world, through ticking clocks, silver globes, and the quiet rooms where a tired emperor tried to hold the universe in his hands. Rudolph was born in 1552 into the House of Habsburg, a family tree so entangled it could have been used as a warning in a genetics textbook. His parents were first cousins. His grandparents were too. By the time Rudolph arrived, the Habsburg Jaw, that famous, tragic piece of facial architecture, had become less a feature and more a family crest. He grew up in Spain, under the shadow of his uncle, King Philip II, the very definition of stern Catholic piety. Philip believed in two things: God and paperwork. His idea of fatherly affection was probably making sure your rosary was polished. So young Rudolph spent his childhood wandering silent corridors, learning that quiet was safer than speaking, and that emotion, like heresy, should be avoided at all costs. When he returned to Vienna as a teenager, he was pale, polite, and fragile, the kind of boy who looked like he might dissolve in strong sunlight. But beneath that stillness was something restless, a curiosity too big for theology, too strange for politics. And when he became emperor in 1576, he decided, almost at once, to move his court to Prague, far from the rules of Spain, far from Vienna's stifling etiquette. He wanted a place where the mind could wander freely, and Prague, half fog, half dream, seemed the perfect place. The city changed under him. He filled it with astronomers, philosophers, painters, mathematicians, and mystics. If someone claimed they could turn lead into gold, Rudolph hired them. If they said they could talk to angels, he gave them a laboratory. He didn't mind being deceived, as long as the deception was beautiful. Among his guests was Tycho Brahe, the Danish astronomer with a prosthetic nose made of brass. He'd lost the original in a duel, apparently over a mathematical formula. There was also Johannes Kepler, who quietly calculated the laws of planetary motion while trying to ignore Brahe's pet elk, which allegedly died after drinking too much beer. There were painters like Arcimboldo, who created portraits made entirely of fruit, flowers, and fish, because, in Rudolph's Prague, even vegetables could be art. The emperor collected everything: mechanical clocks that chimed out of sync, crystals, maps of imaginary lands, instruments that no one knew how to play. He bought paintings of mythic gods, miniature skeletons, and strange fossils believed to be dragon bones. It was said he could spend hours staring at a single shell or clogged gear, entranced by its symmetry, as if, in that pattern, he might find the divine. But as his collections grew, so did his silence. Rudolph began withdrawing from his court. He held no banquets, no public festivals. He stopped attending mass. Visitors would find him alone, wandering his halls at night, staring at the moon through telescopes, speaking softly to himself. He trusted almost no one, least of all his own family. And to be fair, his family did very little to earn it. The Habsburgs were perpetually suspicious of one another, and Rudolph's lack of heirs. He never married, though he fathered several illegitimate children, made things worse. His younger brother, Matthias, was already circling like a polite vulture. Rudolph's mind began to fray. Letters from his courtiers describe him as moody, paranoid, prone to long silences punctuated by bursts of rage. He sometimes locked himself in his chambers for days, emerging pale and trembling. Some said he believed he was cursed. Others whispered that he was simply touched by melancholy, that favorite Renaissance euphemism for depression. And in truth, melancholy was fashionable then, an ailment of intellect, like a soul too large for the world it lived in. But for Rudolph, it wasn't romantic. It was heavy. It was constant. He began to see omens everywhere, in the flicker of candles, in the ticking of his beloved clocks. He surrounded himself with astrologers, begging them to chart his future in the stars. But of course, the stars are indifferent. In 1605, the empire began to crumble around him. Wars, religious tension, and the rise of Protestant factions pulled Europe apart. Rudolph, trapped in his alchemical palace, refused to leave Prague or make decisions. He issued decrees no one followed. He collected astrolabes while his armies deserted. By 1611, his brother Matthias had seized control of the government. The emperor was effectively a prisoner in his own castle. That winter, he fell ill, feverish, delirious, and surrounded by clocks he could no longer bear to hear. Rudolph quietly died, still clutching the key to his collection rooms. He was 58. After his death, his treasures were plundered. The war that followed, the 30 Years' War, swept across Europe like a slow, grinding nightmare, erasing much of what he built. But for a brief, strange moment, under Rudolph's quiet, melancholy reign, the impossible had seemed possible, that magic and reason could coexist, that beauty and science could share the same breath. Maybe that's what makes him so haunting. He wasn't a tyrant or a fool. He was simply a man trying to measure eternity with a clock. He wanted to trap time, to catalog it, polish it, understand it, before it slipped through his fingers. But time, as he learned, doesn't like being kept. It rusts, it fades, it escapes through candle smoke and half-forgotten dreams. And perhaps, in the end, the only thing Rudolph truly collected was silence. So as you drift off tonight, imagine that dim Prague palace, the snow outside falling softly, the halls filled with ticking, whirring, sighing instruments, hundreds of tiny mechanical hearts keeping time for a man who could not, a faint scent of oil, parchment, and loneliness. And in one quiet chamber, a single candle still burns beside a brass telescope pointed at the moon. Somewhere, faintly, a clock chimes midnight, and the emperor, who once tried to own eternity, finally sleeps. The Duchess who vanished from her portrait. Hey everyone, welcome back. If you've made it this far, you're probably already halfway between waking and dreaming. And that's the perfect place to meet tonight's subject, because she, too, exists somewhere between presence and absence, between what is seen and what is remembered. Her name was Isabella of Portugal, and if you've ever stood in a museum and felt that strange, unblinking gaze from a centuries-old portrait, as though someone long dead were studying you, you've probably felt a little of her story. It's a soft, quiet one. No wars, no thrones splitting in half, just the slow fading of a woman who once ruled an empire, and the artist who refused to let her disappear. So, dim the lights. We're stepping into the cool marble halls of 16th century Spain, a world of incense, shadow, and the slow, obsessive brushstrokes of memory. Isabella was born in 1503 into one of Europe's most exhausting families, the Habsburgs again, because apparently history only had about 4 surnames to work with. She was the daughter of Manuel I of Portugal and Maria of Aragon, which meant she was, by birth, connected to roughly half the crowned heads of Europe, and probably her own cousins several times over. Her childhood was quiet, almost monastic. Portugal, in those days, was rich, its ships returning heavy with spices and gold from distant seas. But the royal court was austere, more given to prayer than to laughter. Little Isabella grew up watching priests, maps, and the endless horizon from the palace windows. It made her thoughtful, reserved, and perhaps a little melancholy, a mood that would cling to her all her life, like a scent of lavender that never fades. In 1526, she was married off to Charles V, Holy Roman Emperor, the same Charles who ruled half of Europe and all of Spain's new colonies. He was young, powerful, devout, and already showing the faint signs of that famous Habsburg chin. Their marriage, surprisingly, was affectionate, maybe even loving, by royal standards. Charles traveled constantly, ruling from ships and camps, and Isabella remained in Spain as regent, governing in his absence with calm intelligence and quiet dignity. She wrote letters filled with devotion and worry. He answered with gratitude and apologies. They met rarely. When they did, they seemed to share a kind of fragile peace, the calm of 2 people who understood that love, for them, would always be written in ink and distance. But even the most delicate love stories have an end. In 1539, after one of Charles' rare returns home, Isabella gave birth to a son and fell ill soon after. The fever spread quickly. Her doctors tried everything known to Renaissance medicine, purges, prayers, and the usual collection of leeches and hope. None of it helped. Isabella of Portugal died quietly at the age of 35. Charles was devastated. He shut himself away for months, refusing to see anyone. He wore black for the rest of his life. He kept her rooms untouched, her gowns folded, her books left open on their shelves. He said little, wrote less, and prayed often. And in his grief, he did something unusual. He summoned his court painter, Titian, the Venetian master, and asked him to paint her portrait. Not from life, of course. She was gone, but from memory. Titian had never met her. He had sketches, descriptions, and a single small miniature to work from. But Charles wanted more than likeness. He wanted resurrection. He wanted the woman back, as she had been, or perhaps as he wished she had been. So Titian painted, slowly, carefully, layer upon layer of oil, and light. He shaped her features from shadows, her skin from candle glow, her eyes from grief. When he finished, the emperor stood before the painting for a long time. Then he said softly, "She is here." The portrait became his most treasured possession. He traveled with it everywhere, to war, to treaty negotiations, even to his retirement monastery at Eust. He kept it beside his bed until the day he died. It was said he spoke to it nightly, but there's another layer to the story, because time, as usual, wasn't finished. Centuries later, the painting itself became an enigma. It's serene, luminous, impossibly calm, yet something about it feels distant, not quite real, as if Isabella's soul refused to be entirely captured. Art historians still argue about it. Was it truly her likeness, or a dream painted for a man who could not let go? Some say the face is too idealized, too perfect, that Titian painted not a queen, but grief itself. Others claim her gaze is what makes it haunting. That faint, detached sadness, looking past the viewer, towards something none of us can see. And maybe that's the truth of it. Maybe she did vanish from her own portrait, slipping just out of reach, into the place where memory becomes imagination. Charles V himself didn't last long after her. He abdicated the throne in 1556, retreating to a monastery in Spain to prepare for death, which, knowing Charles, probably involved paperwork and penance. He brought with him that same portrait of Isabella, along with a few clocks, maps, and mementos of his empire. He had the monks hang her painting in his private cell. He would wait, pray, and stare at her face for hours. The same serene face that had outlasted armies, empires, and the man who loved it most. When Charles died, the portrait was placed above his coffin during his funeral rites, and from there, it passed quietly into the royal collections, moving through palaces like a ghost, from El Escorial to the Prado, where she still resides, silent, watching, eternal. There's something soothing about that. In a way, we all fade, even emperors, but sometimes, through pain, patience, and the ache of memory, a fragment stays. A face that still glows centuries later, caught between love and loss, between life and its echo. So as you drift off tonight, imagine that room in El Escorial, the stone walls cold and still, a single candle trembling, and across from it, Isabella's portrait, that soft, golden figure who seems to breathe in the quiet. The emperor is gone. The world that painted her has turned to dust, but she remains, not quite alive, not quite gone, simply remembered. The king who built his own dream. Hey everyone, welcome back. Tonight, we're drifting a little closer to the clouds, to a world of mountains, moonlight, and castles that don't seem entirely real, because, in a sense, they aren't. They were built by a man who preferred imagination to reality, a king who turned loneliness into architecture, and who drowned one evening, still chasing a reflection that looked suspiciously like himself. This is the story of Ludwig II of Bavaria, the Swan King, the fairy tale king, the man who built dreams out of stone, and quietly drowned in one. So, take a deep breath, pull the blanket a little closer. We're heading into Bavaria, and into the mind of a man who tried to live inside his own bedtime story. Ludwig was born in 1845 into a family that could politely be described as decorative but unhinged. The Wittelsbach dynasty had ruled Bavaria for centuries, mostly by marrying the wrong people and building unnecessary palaces. By the time little Ludwig arrived, the royal family's reputation for eccentricity was already well established. His grandfather had a habit of wearing full military uniform to breakfast. His father, King Maximilian II, was scholarly and distant, the kind of man who probably thought hugs were a peasant conspiracy. So Ludwig grew up surrounded by tutors, frescoes, and expectations, but very little affection. His childhood home, Hohenschwangau Castle, overlooked the Alps, perched above a lake that looked like something out of a painting. It was here, gazing at the swans gliding through the mist, that Ludwig's imagination began to bloom. He devoured medieval romances, poetry, and the operas of Richard Wagner, whose music would one day become the soundtrack of his life, and, arguably, his downfall. He once wrote that as a child he lived more in dreams than in reality, and unfortunately for Bavaria, that wasn't a phase. In 1864, at the age of 18, Ludwig became king. Young, handsome, quiet, he was the sort of monarch people described as promising, which usually means not for long. At first, everyone adored him. He was tall, elegant, and looked great on coins. He spoke softly, almost shyly. He had no interest in politics, which made him an immediate improvement over most of his predecessors. But while his ministers fretted about taxes and Prussia, Ludwig was thinking about something far more important: beauty. He wanted to build a kingdom not of laws or armies, but of art. He dreamed of recreating the mythic world of medieval knights and swan maidens, where beauty and chivalry ruled instead of parliament. So he began to build. First came Neuschwanstein Castle. You've probably seen it on a jigsaw puzzle or a Disney logo. It rises from the mountains like a hallucination, all white towers and pointed roofs, as though gravity had politely agreed to take the night off. Every inch of it was designed by Ludwig himself. He filled it with murals of Wagnerian heroes, hidden staircases, secret grottos, and a throne room modeled after heaven. Except there was no throne. He never finished that part, because Neuschwanstein wasn't really meant to be lived in. It was meant to be dreamed in, a kind of architectural lullaby, where reality could be forgotten and beauty could hum softly in the dark. Ludwig built more. Linderhof, a miniature palace inspired by Versailles, where he dined alone while invisible servants brought food through hidden doors. And Herrenchiemsee, another Versailles replica, built on an island, because apparently walking to dinner wasn't dramatic enough. Each palace was more elaborate, more impossible, more empty than the last. He slept by day, lived by candlelight, and spoke to portraits instead of people. He called himself the Moon King. He once said that daylight offended him. By this time, his ministers were losing their patience and their budget. Bavaria was small, its treasury smaller, and Ludwig was spending like a man auditioning for bankruptcy. He ignored them, of course. Reality was always someone else's problem. He withdrew further, riding through the mountains at night, wrapped in furs, reciting poetry to himself. He visited Wagner's operas obsessively, often alone in private performances he commissioned. When Wagner fell out of political favor, Ludwig sent him lavish letters begging him to return. He called him my friend, my God. It was not a healthy dynamic. By the 1880s, the court whispered that the king had gone mad. He rarely appeared in public. He refused to see his ministers. He stopped signing documents. He had the royal kitchens prepare elaborate feasts for imaginary guests. He ordered a dining table that could be raised and lowered through the floor, so he wouldn't have to see the servants. Even for royalty, that's advanced solitude. In 1886, they decided they'd had enough. A group of politicians, doctors, and distant cousins quietly signed a document declaring Ludwig insane and unfit to rule. It was based on the testimony of people who hadn't seen him in years. They sent soldiers to arrest him at Neuschwanstein, which, to be fair, was exactly the kind of castle you'd build if you expected to be attacked someday by relatives with clipboards. They took him away to Berg Castle, a smaller, quieter place on the edge of Lake Starnberg. He arrived calm, silent, still believing, perhaps, that this was all part of some vast misunderstanding that beauty would eventually resolve. The next evening, June 13, 1886, he went for a walk along the lake with his psychiatrist, Dr. Gudden. It was twilight. The lake was calm. They never came back. Hours later, their bodies were found floating near the shore. No one heard a struggle. No one knows what happened. The doctor's hat was found crushed. Ludwig's watch had stopped at 6:54. Officially, they drowned. Unofficially, no one believes the official version. Some say he was murdered. Others that he took his own life. Or perhaps, just perhaps, the king who built his own dream simply stepped into it. After his death, the castles were open to the public. The same ministers who declared him mad now charged admission to the world he'd built. They made a fortune. Neuschwanstein became one of the most visited palaces on earth. Its image, his fantasy, would one day inspire Walt Disney's Cinderella Castle. The king who hated reality became, in death, one of its most beloved fantasies. There's a quiet sort of poetry in that. He wanted beauty, not politics, dreams, not duty. And though he drowned in solitude, his castles still stand, half asleep in the clouds, waiting for anyone who needs a place to rest from the noise of the world. So if you ever find yourself in Bavaria, looking up at those white towers in the mist, remember Ludwig, the lonely dreamer who tried to live inside his imagination, and who, in some small way, succeeded, because sometimes the only way to survive reality is to build a dream big enough to live in. The prince who wouldn't grow up. Hey everyone, welcome back. Tonight, let's drift towards something gentler, something quieter. A story not about war or madness, but about waiting, about a man born to be king, who never quite got around to it. He lived in palaces, smiled at cameras, cut ribbons, and waited for a crown, for purpose, for adulthood. And when the crown finally arrived, it was too late. This is the story of Prince Edward of Wales, the man who spent his life rehearsing for a play that never really began. Edward was born in 1841, the eldest son of Queen Victoria and Prince Albert, which meant, from the moment he existed, his entire life was planned. It was written out in tutors, schedules, expectations, and an endless supply of disappointment. Queen Victoria adored her husband, Albert. She did not, unfortunately, adore her children. She found them loud, demanding, and, in her own words, little more than inconveniences. When she looked at Edward, she saw everything her perfect husband wasn't. He was slow to learn, easily distracted, fond of fun, in short, human, which for a Victorian monarch was considered a character flaw. Albert, ever the reforming German prince, decided that discipline was the cure. He built a timetable for young Edward that could have exhausted a small army. Latin at 7, military drills by 8, moral essays before lunch, and, if he behaved, dinner conversation with adults who disapproved of him. Nothing says royal childhood quite like supervised misery. Edward tried. He really did. But he wasn't built for duty. He liked laughter, food, conversation, the soft, human things that made his father nervous. While his tutors complained about his lack of focus, his servants quietly adored him. He listened to people. He had warmth. He wasn't his father. And that, perhaps, was his greatest crime. When Albert died suddenly in 1861, Queen Victoria blamed her son. Albert had fallen ill after visiting Edward at military training camp, where, to his horror, he learned that the prince had been sneaking off to meet a young actress. The shock, she decided, had killed him. It hadn't, of course, but grief rarely consults reason. Victoria withdrew from public life and plunged into mourning. Edward, at 20, became both her heir and her scapegoat. She called him frivolous, worthless, incapable. She refused to let him take on royal duties. And so, the Prince of Wales waited for forgiveness that never came. For the next 40 years, he waited. He attended dinners, opened exhibitions, inspected troops, always as the supporting act, never the lead. His entire existence was an intermission. He became an expert at small talk, fashion, and patience. He smoked cigars, gambled moderately, ate excessively, and collected friends the way others collected stamps. He loved Paris, its restaurants, its courtesans, its cheerful disregard for moral restraint. He was happiest abroad, where he could be himself, charming, witty, slightly scandalous. He had a soft spot for good food, better wine, and spectacularly impractical clothes. He once commissioned a hunting outfit made entirely of white silk, because of course he did. And yet, beneath the indulgence, there was a quiet melancholy. He wasn't cruel or foolish, just perpetually postponed. Every time he tried to act, his mother's shadow reminded him to wait. Victoria lived, and lived, and lived. She reigned for 63 years, long enough for Edward to watch the entire 19th century change without him. He saw the telegraph, the railway, the photograph, the telephone, all arrive and settle into daily life, while he remained, perpetually, the prince. By the time she finally died in 1901, Edward was 59. He had spent more than half a century rehearsing for a role that should have been his decades earlier. When he finally became King Edward VII, the world barely recognized him. He was overweight, charming, and slightly exhausted. The newspapers called him the Uncle of Europe, which sounds affectionate until you realize it's what people say when someone is too old to be the main character. Still, he made the most of it. He reintroduced warmth into the British monarchy. He hosted dinners, reopened palaces, made the crown seem human again. He knew that charm was a political tool, one he'd been perfecting for 50 years. He didn't change the empire. He didn't conquer new lands. He simply made the monarchy likable, which, after his mother's iron reign, was quite an achievement. Edward ruled for just 9 years. He died in 1910, peacefully, surrounded by the same people who'd spent most of his life waiting with him. The crown passed to his son, George V, who was everything Edward wasn't: disciplined, serious, and perpetually worried about the family's reputation. In a way, Edward's warmth didn't survive him. His reign was a sigh, a brief exhale between 2 centuries of formality. But perhaps that was enough. When people talk about history's great rulers, Edward rarely makes the list. He didn't build an empire, or win a war, or leave behind grand reforms. He left behind cigarette smoke, laughter, and the memory of a man who tried, in his quiet way, to make monarchy bearable. He once said that he was always late, but always loved, and perhaps that's the truest thing ever said about him, because Edward VII wasn't a great king, he was a human one. He spent his life waiting to be something more, and when he finally got there, he was already tired. But for those brief years, he showed the world that kindness, charm, and a good dinner could rule a nation just as well as fear or grandeur. So tonight, as you drift towards sleep, think of the prince who never stopped waiting, who smiled through a lifetime of delay, who filled the endless hours not with bitterness, but with warmth. Sometimes, greatness isn't in what we do, it's in what we endure, and how gently we endure it.